Buonasera a tutti, good evening everybody, and welcome at the Italian Cultural Institute. This is the first conversation of a new series, Italian Journeys of American Writers, and we will have in the series several talks with American writers who will share their experience of an Italian journey, or more than one, be it real, imaginary, or metaphorical, but one that is personal and shows their bond with our country. The first encounter is with Michael Frank, whose talk is titled Making Friends with Michele, My Italian Doppelganger. Is an intriguing and also enigmatic title, and she is going to explain us. Michael Frank is a journalist and a writer. His essays, articles, and short stories have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, Slate, the Yale Review, Salmagundi, the Time Literary Supplement, and Tablet, among others publications. His fiction has been presented at Symphony Space's Selected Shorts, a celebration of the short story, and his travel writing has been collected in Italy, the best travel writing from the New York Times. He served as a contributing writer to the Los Angeles Times Book Review for nearly 10 years. But above all, he is the author of The Mighty Franks. This is the main reason why I invite him, because this is a really beautiful memoir about an unusual Hollywood family and his family. And his two grandmothers, his parents, and his aunt and uncle are both characters and real persons that you can forget after reading the book. His second novel, Fertility, will be published next October. And he lives with his family in New York City and also in Italy. And this is perhaps the reason why he accepted to come to the Institute in Kamali. And so please welcome Michael Frank.
Thank you, Giorgio, and thank you to the Istituto and all of you for coming tonight. And I'm going to do a little reading, but I'll try not to seem like I'm reading, except for this first part, which is going to be a paragraph that many of you probably know, or some of you may know, from the great Lessico Familiare, Family Lexicon of Ginsberg, a book that is very important to me. And it goes like this. My parents had 5 children. We now live in different cities, some of us in foreign countries, and we don't write to each other often. When we do meet up, we can be indifferent or distracted. But for us, it takes just one word. It takes one word, one sentence, one of the old ones from our childhood, heard and repeated countless times. All it takes is for one of us to say, "We haven't come to Bergamo on a military campaign," or "sulfuric acid stinks of fart." And we immediately fall back into our old relationships, our childhood, our youth, all inextricably linked to those words and phrases. If my siblings and I were to find ourselves in a dark cave or among millions of people, just one of those phrases or words would immediately allow us to recognize each other. Those phrases are our Latin, the dictionary of our past. They're like Egyptian or Assyro-Babylonian hieroglyphics, evidence of a vital core that has ceased to exist but that lives on in its texts, saved from the fury of the waters, the corrosion of time. So this is the first book I ever finished in Italian, although I'm reading it to you this evening in English. And it stayed with me for many years because it gave me a kind of permission, or I eventually allowed it to, and I'll return to how in just a moment. A few years ago, I was jogging in the Villa Doria Pamphili with my friend Wendy Arton, who's a painter who lives in Rome and now also in Boston. And she said to me, how is it that you have such a strong relationship with this country anyway? We'd been friends for about 15 years by the time she thought to ask that question. And I had no answer, which I thought was kind of strange. Anyway, no answer really formulated. It's funny, I think, how you don't have the answers to the most basic questions in your life. It's sort of like looking out the window at the view every day and not really taking it in. There's some things that are easier to say that it isn't. It's not a romance. No Under the Tuscan Sun for me, much as I love Toscana. I cringe when I read books like that and see movies like that that sentimentalize this country. Anybody who's held a job in Italy and had to quit it in order to get paid, in order to eat, and then be rehired afterward in order to eat and get paid, or something like that, as I did in my 20s, is not going to sentimentalize the place. Anybody who's seen so many Ngamba young people have to leave over these recent years, or has seen the country fall into such a mess politically, rivaling only this country, though I think we're going to win, doesn't hold on to a romantic notion of a place like that. Nevertheless, I have a huge and deep love of Italy, and it's very personal and quirky. I'm going to tell you a little bit about it tonight. As Giorgio pointed out, I have a doppelganger whose name is Michele. Michele is a much more likable person than I am. Even to me, he's much more likable. He's open, he's buoyant, he's curious, he's ironic, and he dares. I may be a few of those things, but never in the same way as Michele. A few other things about him. He has a very strong American accent when he speaks Italian, and that will never change. He likes to swim at night in Sicily. He might as well have more hair than I do. And everywhere he goes, just about everywhere he goes in Italy, he feels at home. How did he come about? Doppelganger. Per Webster's, double or ghostly counterpart of a living person. Also from Webster's. According to age-old German folklore, all living creatures have a spirit double who is invisible but identical to the living individual. These second selves are perceived as being distinct from ghosts, which appear only after death, and sometimes they are described as the spiritual opposite or negative of their human counterparts. In 1796, German writer Johann Paul Richter, who wrote under the pseudonym Jean Paul, coined the word Doppelganger from Doppel meaning double and Ganger meaning goer to refer to such specters. I go for opposite instead of negative because Michele has been such a positive influence on Michael. There are three iterations of Michele, one in his 20s, one in his late 30s, and one at a time when you stop keeping track of age, which is, of course, the most interesting time because it's when, as I've been noticing, all time frames seem to blur together. I said this in a different talk recently, that it's been happening to me more and more these days, and I don't know if it's because my parents are very old, or because I'm getting older, or because I'm just about to put another book into the world, and that has a way of scrambling your sense of where you are and who you are for a little while. That novel, by the way, which is called Fertility, and as Giorgio said, will be published here in the fall and will be published next spring in Italy, is partly set in Italy, which I think is a very tricky business for an American writer, as I've already been warned, because you talk yourself into believing you know a place when in fact you can't really ultimately, and you're bound to make many mistakes. So it'll be a novel full of errors, I'm sure. Probably this is a good time to explain why Giorgio, I think, invited me here. As he mentioned, in the May of 2017, I published a memoir called The Mighty Franks, which then was published in 6 countries after here, including Italy, where it was titled I Formidabili Frank, and that's thanks to Andrea Canobio, my editor at Einaudi, a wonderful title. It's the story of my very intertwined family. My parents and my aunt and uncle were siblings, so brother and sister married sister and brother. Some of you have heard this story about 14 times, but some of you may not have. My aunt and uncle were the older couple. They were 2 cultivated, glamorous, accomplished, beautiful Hollywood screenwriters in the 60s and 70s. They had no children. and lived just 2 blocks from us where I grew up in Laurel Canyon in Los Angeles. They desperately wanted a child, and so they borrowed, or depending on who's telling the story, tried to steal me. I learned a great deal from them. I received many gifts from them, but they were also rather complicated people, and my aunt, as she aged, became darker and more angry and more dramatic in the way she behaved and in the way she treated people she loved. They loved Europe. Y-U-R-P was a nickname for Europe in the family. London first, Paris next, with just a toe into Italy, but just enough of a toe to whet my appetite. Europe for them was a place, a magical place of possibility, of cultural awakenings, of sights, of the old world, the grand tour, everything that America wasn't. Another parenthetical. Before I found my Doppelganger, Michele, in Italy, there was the unborn child of my aunt and uncle, sometimes a boy, sometimes a girl, called Agatha. This creature was a gifted poet. I wrote very bad poetry. This child was a Rhodes Scholar. I never dreamed of such a thing. This unborn, non-existing child was, had style, was worldly. I was none of those things too. He, for a long time I tried to fill his or her place until I realized it's impossible to fill the place of a missing human being, an absent person. And finally I realized, as I think sometimes is the case in certain family problems and certain life problems, the only solution was to go away. And so I went to Florence, where I met Michele 1.0. Why Florence? Well, as a kid, I drew and painted, and I kept drawing all my life. And if you study art and art history, all roads lead to the Uffizi. Or the monk cells at San Marco, my favorite place of all in that beautiful city. Honestly, I'm not 100% sure how it happened, but after university, and I'd been studying French and Spanish my whole life, being from Los Angeles, I had to speak Spanish. I took a class in Italian, in an extension class. The teacher wore leather pants, which I'd never seen in my life until that point. And she had frosted blonde hair, and she was from Florence. And she said, "You're pretty good at this language. You should get better. Why don't you go to Florence? You have nothing to do with your life, do you?" And I thought, okay, why not? Someone's giving me a little direction. That's what I'll do. Before I left, she gave me the name of a pensione, the Pensione Biaci. She said, "This is not for you. It's far too fancy. But should your parents visit, make sure that they stay there." I arrived in Florence, signed up for a language school. How I found out about that, I have no idea, because we're pre-internet, and I don't think there was an international phone book. But I turned up. They put me up in a pensione that had bugs and gettone for the shower, if anybody remembers that, and humidity. And they were very spare with the electricity, I'm sure, a very post-war saving program that was still going on 30 years later. And so I wandered over one day to the Biaci just to see what was what. And there I met a woman called Senora Bachchan, who at the time might have been my aunt's age, just about, or a bit older. A very vibrant, larger-than-life human being, and I had a certain experience with women of that nature. She presided over the Pensione Biaci with an iron pencil. This pencil she used to write again and again in the palimpsest of her registry book, letting people in if she liked them and not if she didn't. She threw it at her staff when she got angry at them, and she gestured when she wanted to make a point. She had, it seemed, some student rooms, little cubicles on the top floor, no bathroom, barely a window, and a chamber pot should you need to pee in the middle of the night. I never did that, just for the record. Even then, I think I had an ear for a mystery or a story, and there was something about Senora Bachchan that just didn't add up. She used to invite me to her lavish apartment that overlooked the Arno, full of tapestries and paintings and little silver doodads. It seemed a little grand for the hotel keeper, but what did I know? She wouldn't answer questions about her husband or her parentage. "Oh, my parents. like that. Oh, my husband, he's away. Something wasn't quite right. In the Pensione Biaci, every afternoon, there was an old lady, an impoverished German baroness, who sat typing up the hand-penciled documents that Senora Bachchan wrote. I learned from the night staff that she had danced with Hitler. Danced with Hitler. And as I see now, only as I was putting together these thoughts for this talk tonight, how two of the themes that have run through my life and are running through my work crystallized in the Pensione Biaci. It happened that the November of that year that I wandered by a ceremony commemorating the deportation of the Jews from Florence. November 6th and November 11th, 1943, and then a small batch in 1944, 243 people out of the population of 3,000 Florentine Jews. In the rain, I watched a grouping of people stand and give speeches. And I thought, I need to know more about this. I was 21 years old. I knew nothing about the history of the Jews in Italy. And I began to read. I think I checked out the first copy that had been checked out in 40 years of Cecil Roth's History of the Italian Jews from the British Institute Library that was across the river. I started reading Bassani. I read Svevo. I read Primo Levi, of course. Skipping forward in time, it's become a thread that really has run through my life and my work. I've written about the missing Jewish library in Rome that was confiscated by the Nazis and half of which never returned, thanks to our friends at Centro Primo Levi, Alexandra Cassin, and Natalia Drimi, who put on an incredible evening on that subject. I've written about the anniversary of the Venetian Ghetto. One day I received an email from a friend of mine who lives in Livorno, and it went something like this. Caro Michele, my mother, during the war, in September of 1944, in fact, moved into an apartment in a small village in the Marche. Living in the apartment at that time was a mysterious woman who spoke fluent Italian and said that she was from Puglia, but had gotten stuck in the north of Italy. And she was waiting out the war. My mother thought this was a very strange story, and this woman didn't know anything about our Catholic habits. When we went to church, she didn't know to genuflect. She didn't know what to do with the wafer. She knew no prayers. Finally, she revealed to us that she was Jewish and had become stranded as a former medical student and young doctor, and was hiding out thanks to a priest who had put her up, who had found her this apartment to live with us. When they parted, 9 months later, she said she had a brother in New York and her plan was to go there. We have not heard from her since. Could you find out what happened to this lady? That was a tall order. Natalia helped me with that. She put me in touch with this wonderful woman called Anna Pizzuti, who has a database. She's maintaining a very detailed database of what happened to the Jews and the foreigners who were caught in Italy during the war. The white pages helped. And finally, I found her nephew living in Washington, D.C., and I was able to answer the question of what happened to this mysterious young girl who was living in an apartment in the Marche. Just one of many stories cast up from the time of the war. Most importantly, in this vein, for 2 years now, I've been listening to the story of a woman who has one of the rarest brains and memories and spirits of anyone I've ever met, Stella Levy, sitting here in front of me this evening, who is the Rhodes-born Italian survivor, one of 150 odd of the deportation from the island of Rhodes of the entire Jewish community, which was one of the latest deportations in the war, July of 1944, one of the longest journeys from Rhodes in the Eastern Mediterranean all the way by way of Athens to Auschwitz. Lots of parentheticals, as I said. Returning for a moment to Senora Bachchan, she embodied another strand that has fed a theme that has become very important to me, which is origin stories. I had an intuition about her, a feeling, but only a feeling then. The facts emerged after her death, and they were quite colorful indeed. Her mother, Celia, was the secretary and secret longtime lover of Harold Acton's father, Arthur. So she was the half-sister of the great Italophile and writer on Italy, whom I went to hear when I was living at the Biachi, someone who was very prominent in his day and is probably a little bit forgotten now, but was a great transmitter of Italian culture and history to English-speaking readers. Confused origins have a lot of power over me, I think, because my own felt somewhat confused as a child with my aunt and uncle, with my unnamed American Doppelganger. In this novel of mine, the young character who's 17, turning 18, Andrew Weissman, is himself confused about his parentage. It's the framework of another novel I have underway. I think Michele led Michael to these stories, and I thank him for that. I thank him also for being much more comfortable in the world than Michael is, or was. Michele got a job teaching English. What else was I qualified for, of course? Michele, after leaving the Senora Bachchan's student room, had his first apartment with a fresco on the ceiling in Via della Vigna Vecchia. After a childhood of being bullied and isolated for being the kind of kid who drew and painted and who brought Jane Austen to school with him in 6th grade, not a good thing to do. I know that now, looking back. He had no friends, or very few friends. And in Florence, he made all kinds of friends. He had confidence. He was open. He was an adventurer. And I think it's because he was able to speak a different language and to become himself in a different culture and in a different place. Virtually the whole time that Michele 1.0 and I were roommates, I said to myself, who are you? And I never really found the answer to that question. And now for a little dark interval as a palate cleanser. For many years, I chained myself to my desk. Excuse me, and I tried to write the story of these people, my people of origin, as a novel. But of course a novel. A novel was like Europe. It was the place to go, the thing to be. It was the thing in my family, even if my aunt and uncle were screenwriters. After a certain point, Michael refused to go visit Michele in Italy. He said, you may not go to that place of goodness until you finish this manuscript. As you see, I had not yet read my Ginsberg. I had not yet come to trust that if you mine the story of your family, if you are able to capture the private language of your people, of the people who made you, if you explore it accurately and truthfully, it transmits in the specific. I'm convinced you can find the universal. I didn't understand any of that yet. I finished the novel, and what happened? It was rejected. Universally. The figure of that aunt, she's just not believable, my readers said. I smiled, and I went mute for a little while. Some time passed, journalism, short stories, life. In 1999, I went to Rome for 3 months as a visiting writer at the American Academy, Michele 2.0. He was very much like Michele 1.0, except he was a little more Roman in his interests now. Ancient history, Italian politics, God help him, archaeology. He made some life-changing friendships. He read Lessico Familiare, and he began to wonder, is this the way? Is this how I should tell my story? At the end of the year, from a friend I inherited from my friend Temple Carr, who is sitting here today, whom I met in the Biachi, back when we were in those decades of our 20s, Elisabetta Beraldo brought me to Liguria, where both Michael and Michele felt weirdly at home in this strange hill town with these strange, largely unfriendly people. A geography that reminded me of Laurel Canyon because it was steep and difficult and you sweated every time you left the door, or you walked out the door. Michael and Michele were coming closer together. One more interlude. Michael got married. Michael had a child. Michael insisted on never-ending Italian lessons for his wife. And his daughter, who, as soon as she could squeak, began to squeak partly in Italian, thank you to Pierina Bonerba, who has just walked in late this evening. Finally, I return to the nature, the challenge of this book. Well, I should have, but one more detour. I was 3/4 of the way into the novel that's going to be published this fall when my uncle died. And it was like a spell being broken in a fairy tale. I saw finally the deep fear, the deep uncertainty of these enormous, gargantuan household gods of mine. I saw that what lay beneath all the anger and disappointment and all that drama, and there was a lot of it, you can read it in the book for sale afterward outside, were two very scared, very old human beings. It was a surreal, dreamlike, transformative moment. Ginsberg said once, autobiography crept up on me like a wolf. I love that. In my case, though, it leapt, pounced maybe like a panther or an ocelot. That word is for Georgia. I returned to New York, and there and in Italy, in Rome, in a borrowed apartment, in Kamali, I began to write The Mighty Franks. Ginsberg herself said, in order to write the family lexicon, she had to be in England. She had to be away from Torino. She had to have that distance. I'm convinced that if the book works at all, it's because of Michele, because Michele knew he had to go away, because Michele learned another language, and because Michele developed an authority in his prose, which is the only way that you can tell a story about your family. You can't be timid, and you can't care what they're going to think. So I'm leaving out lots of stuff, naturally, hundreds of books read, dozens of places visited up and down the peninsula. In a movie or a novel, the story might be, end here, curtain. Michael and Michele fused, a flawless match. But no, there's Michele 3.0. Just a small taste to him to underline that as with any relationship like this, you need to nourish it. You need to keep going back, or at least check in periodically. Last June, I was invited to talk about I Formidabili Frank at the literary festival in Gavoy in Sardinia. Michael, that is, was invited, and he traveled there, imbecile that he can be, with a very negative attitude, which we should really identify as a very fearful attitude. Who will care about this story in Gavoy, I wondered. Los Angeles, Laurel Canyon, Zia Hanky. This is a land of bandits. There's not even a sea here. Despite weeks of intense brush-up lessons in that ever-elusive, and in my case, highly Americanized language, will Michael even be able to speak in Italian? And to whom? Who will show up at 10:30 at night, the time they gave me a slot? At the hotel, the negativity continued. I was convinced I'd landed in The Shining. There was a beautiful lake. There was a beautiful lake by the road, and I asked the woman behind the desk, "Can I swim there?" "Well, you can," she said, "but the last person who tried, a German tourist, was never seen again except for her shoes." There was mold in the bathroom. The floor was icy. There was a perfume of humidity. My wife and dog, Kamuji, named for Kamoi, were due to arrive the next day in Rome. I'll do my thing at 10:30 at night, and I'll get on a plane the next morning, I told myself. It's just fascinating how much one's old self, I hope not one's core self, keeps rearing up through life. At 7:30 that evening, I got on the navetta, which was a little shuttle bus that took you from The Shining to the town. And I sat next to Chiara Valerio, who was to be my interlocutor that evening. And in one burst of conversation, one burst of human connection with this vibrant writer and editor and provocatrice, Michael withdrew and Michele came forward. Abacadabra, just like that. Michael took a look at the 300 empty white plastic chairs at 10:25 in the evening and started sweating. But Michele said, "Pazienza." By 10:40, 250 people were sitting there. People think I go back every year to eat the pesto,
20 years in Liguria by now, or to swim at night in Menfi, 9 years coming up. But really, it's to check in with Michele, because Michele is a muscle I need to use, or else I'm just destined to be dreary old Michael. Michele has led me to magical places, beginning with the monk cells in Florence, to the Biachi. He's led me to some very strange places, too, like the town of Menfi on the southern coast of Italy, a town that a journalist friend of mine calls metaphysical, because all the windows and shutters are closed for months at a time, and you have no idea what's going on behind those shutters. Maybe it's criminal, maybe it's poverty, maybe it's richness. It's a place that I came to know, as I've come to know so many places in Italy, by reading. In this case, a fantastic book by Stefano Malatesta called Il cane che andava per mare, which sadly has not yet been translated into English. And it's a series of portraits of Italian, Sicilian eccentrics. Malatesta, as it turns out, has a house just up the road from where we go in Menfi. But really what he gave me was a prism, a way to see what I was experiencing there and come to understand it. It's not just the sheer antiquity of a place like Sicily, although it gets an A+ for the Greek ruins, naturally, but it's for things like the fish auction in Selinunte, which is held just below the temples. Fishermen come in and pour their catch onto the table, and it's like the subject of a Roman mosaic, and they're still writhing, waiting to be bought in reverse prices. You start high and go low. It's having dinner with the local mayor, the sindaco of Menfi, a man of about my age, who came to dinner one night and told us how, as a boy, he remembered paying a condolence call with his father on his neighbor. 10 men were sitting around a table, crying, black armbands around their upper arms. They had lost the family mule. Henry James has this fascination with the visitable past, how you can see back in time and touch what was. Michele loves this sort of thing. So does Michael. If you love origin stories, all stories, really, how could you not? Michele, I've learned, likes a challenge, but he also likes to conquer a challenge. The rewards come in the form of connection to places that you grow to love because maybe in part they're so difficult and so closed. The people that you come to love because you have to reach across a cultural and linguistic divide. The readers you find. This was the biggest surprise for me of my last year. From Gavoy forward, from Naples to Torino, from Campobasso to Ferrara, I crisscrossed the country. I went to 16, 18 different places. All along the road, I met so many wonderful people who responded to my book, and in responding and asking questions, taught me things about myself and my writing and my family that I had no idea about. It was the strangest and most wonderful experience. In my own small way, that experience served as, and the comparison is meant to be very humble, though, at my end, the same way that To the Lighthouse did for Virginia Woolf when she said that once she finished writing it, she no longer was haunted by her mother, who had died when she was 13. This happened for me because I published my book, not only in my own culture, but in an adopted one. Something about the act of becoming Michele allowed Michael, finally, to put his story behind him. I'm going to just close with something from Ginsberg, where she began. In her preface. The places, events, and people in this book, she writes, are real. I haven't invented a thing, and each time I found myself slipping into my long-held habits as a novelist and made something up, I was quickly compelled to destroy the invention. Check. I have written only what I remember. Even though the story is real, I think one should read it as if it were a novel, and therefore not demand of it any more or less than a novel can offer. Gnomic, confusing, but check. Parenthetical. In Italy, no one cares what you call your book. It's a book. It's memoir, a novel. It's a book. I had little desire to talk about myself, she says. This is not, in fact, my story, but rather, even with gaps and lacuna, the story of my family. I must add that during my childhood and adolescence, I always thought about writing a book about the people whom I lived with and who surrounded me at the time. Check, check, check. In my case, I actually thought I was living in a book. Finally, there are so many things that I do remember but decided not to write about. To this I say, stay tuned for The Mighty Have Fallen, or I Formidabili Decaduti. Thank you. Glad that's over.
Thank you, Michael. I think that there will be many questions from the public, but I would like to ask one thing before. It's a joke, obviously, now to say there is Michele and Michael, but at the same time, do you think that it's really it's real for a person that changed completely the situation of his life? Now, for example, we have a series here at the Institute about exiling creativity now, and we saw a lot of situations in which people left Italy, came here, and changed the language, changed the geography, changed the weather, and in a certain way, this changed also their life, also the way they look at the things, also the way they did their job.
Has that happened to you in the years you've lived here?
I don't know, 4 years is not so, I don't know if it's enough, but yes, in a certain way, I think that when you said now that you are more social in Italy than in the US, okay, for me it's different because I arrived here at 60, but in a certain way, yes. I think that when you arrive in a complete different situation, you feel more free than...
I think your pores are open.
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah. And so, please tell something about it.
I agree with that. I mean, I think that as a person and as a writer, I think it's always important to be changing your point of view and to be not thinking in rigid, set channels, which are much easier to do for all of us. And one way to open those channels up, of course, the main way is to read and listen. But sometimes that's not enough. I think you just simply have to put yourself in another context. I think as a writer, for instance, when I get stuck and I leave the desk that I'm insisting at sitting at, something changes. And if you expand that to a larger template, leaving the house, leaving the city, leaving the country, and then going to a place where you have a history of worlds opening up, ideas opening up, stories coming at you, I think you see things more clearly when you're away. My friend Max Kozlov, the literary art critic and art historian, said to me once, they don't realize that everything they're doing is foreign to us. They're just going about their lives, you know? And I think that's true. When you go to another country, everything is vivid. Everything. Buying chewing gum, watching oranges be juiced in Marrakesh, the way they handle food, the way they walk, the way they wear their clothes, the language. You could spend your whole life just listening. The smells. One whiff of a certain kind of sewery smell, and I'm in Florence in 2 seconds. Beautiful perfume in summer. So yeah, I think it's very true. I think it's really important to go away.
Okay. I asked if you have some question for Michael.
Yes, Miss Arkin.
Just one very small comment on what you were just saying about going someplace new, the shock to the senses. I saw that put once in a book review about travel, and someone saying the point when you go away is not to find yourself, which we hear people saying sometime I went abroad in order to find myself. The point is to lose yourself. I think that's very apropos of what you were saying. My question, was it by coincidence or by choice that you, I gather, I have it right, that the huge majority of the appearances that you made, book readings and book appearances and book talks, took place in Italy rather than the other countries in which the book was published?
Nobody else invited me. Except in America. No, I traveled in Spain a little bit, but I think it's because I spoke the language, and there are not badly, I'm going to keep saying, with that thick, awful American accent, but I think having the language just changed everything. Because I went to a number of presentations at festivals where there were English native-speaking writers, and it's just not the same, because you have to wait while this person over here then, in delay, 5-second delay. Amazing translators. I couldn't believe these people, the nuances they got. 3 notes on their pad, and I interviewed one afterward. I was so fascinated. She showed me her paper. It was unintelligible, but she has this private language. Spectacular, but not convincing, not alive in the same way. Of course, it's the only way to communicate, and for some people, I was just lucky that I could break through that wall of language. So, yeah.
So it was unexpected.
A happy, unexpected plus, yeah. Yes. So, but you had your hand. Yeah.
I was just curious, what made you settle in Kamali? Because that's a very small place, and it's beautiful. But,
yes, it is beautiful. The beauty is the thing I like least about it, though, I have to say.
Oh, well, you have to tell us. What do you like most about it?
I like the challenge of it. But the truth is, I went there because a friend of mine took me there, and I never left. That's how passive I am. That was my mother-in-law piping up, by the way. Yeah, right. It was all about the people. One person led to another and led to another. And also I'm totally intrigued by Genoa as a city because it's so incomprehensible geographically, spiritually. It has a very mixed history. It's very closed yet very open. I get lost. I've been going there for 20 years. I get lost every single time I go there. Every time I go there, I discover something new. You speak of the visitable past. There are businesses that have been there for generations. This couple that sell cork to close your wine bottles and string. Okay. Things like that. You wander upon these beautiful, neglected parts of a city and you want to know everything about it. So, yeah. Yes.
Could you speak to, in learning the language, were there things as you were learning it where you went, the way this language works is so different, and it is part of the Michele experience that you described?
It's a never-ending quest to get it right, can I just say. I can joke, which is a good thing, I think. My niece once said to me, you can make people laugh in a foreign language, that's a good thing. And I take pride in that. I make terrible mistakes. I find myself entering a sentence and not knowing how to get out of it, which is very typical, but that's why they invented the word quindi, because you can just shrug and say, allora, quindi, and everyone understands what you mean. And if you listen, people do that all the time, so it's not just me. But it's really interesting how the rhythms of that language are so deeply different, and that I'm sure they affect the way people think also. And I noticed that in particular when I was reviewing the translation of my book, and I read enough Italian with help, lots of help, to try to work out how things got so tangled at some moments. And part of it is because of the general way the language works. So many dependent clauses, not needing to pause the way we do in English, not needing to be pithy, which isn't to say that Italiani are not pithy, but we have a very distinct thing in English that is not really reproducible in Italian. And getting yourself to sound like that as a speaker of English is like remaking your brain. And it's not, it's just, it's a fascinating puzzle, lifelong for me. Thank you for that question, Mr. Webb.
First of all, I have to thank you very much, because thanks to you, the Americans, you know, have been very interested in traveling to Italy. And, you know, you help us a lot. So thank you.
And anybody go to Kamali, though? Sorry. No,
Kamali, we have other friends.
Or Menfi. Oh, I shouldn't have named the places.
I am from Liguria, so I know very well the area. But I'm very interested because you speak Italian with an American accent. But because you travel a lot in Italy, do you change your attitude to the regional accent to make this feeling getting deeper in the relation with the people? Because there is a lot of difference. When you go to Menfi,
absolutely,
you have to get the accent to get involved with them. When you go to Camoglia, you have the Cocina from Genoa. And when you go to Venice and Piedmont, this is very interesting.
I don't think I changed the accent, but that's a really great question. But you do change the way you behave in different regions, because the Siciliani are so open and friendly. The Romans, excuse me to the one of them I know, there are two of them at least in this room, are incredibly friendly, but you don't always quite know what they're thinking. The Genovese are unfriendly, and so you know what they're thinking all the time. And I'll tell you a story. I was 15 years going to the same place in the hills above Camogli, and I go for a run every morning and pass all of the local folk on their way to do their errands, perhaps running, older, younger. Nobody ever says buongiorno. It's absolutely against the local religion. And I decided, this is making me unhappy. This is my happy place. I'm going to make them happy. And so I started going out and saying buongiorno to every single person I crossed paths with. And this is what I would often get in response. But I felt better. And in the end, now I know all the people up and down the street. And next thing you know, we're going to have a big old potluck and discuss this problem, the problem of buongiorno. You're welcome.
But that's something that is, for you, easier to say, for example, in Italian than in English, or...
I don't say hello to anybody here. Are you kidding? This is New York City. They'll kill you. Non è vero, no. It depends, in fact. But there's so many things I wish I could bring the Michele skills into the Michael life more often. It's not that easy. I think we're very determined by where we live. The pace and freneticism, intensity, competitiveness, aggressiveness, infiniteness of this city has its own magic, but you need to be elsewhere in order to live at certain times in the year, I do believe. Yeah, here. Mr. Vinny. I love a softball question. Yes, Michele can cook. Michael can also cook. Michael does all the cooking. I've learned a lot through food, I have to say. Food has been, of course, in that country is so central. It gives you such access to people. I learned a lot from my 97-year-old friend, Maria Luisa, who one day when I was said to her, and she was giving me the recipe for ripieni, which in Liguria, they make a lot out of very little from years of poverty and being isolated hill folk and the rest, and having no cows, which is fine for me since I'm a vegetarian, fish eating. And she was giving me her recipe for ripieni, and she said, then you put in the marjoram. And I said, well, why not oregano? Because you've been doing it that way for 50 years? And she said, 500. And that's about it. There is no shaking up those recipes. You do them. And the other fascinating thing is, you're going out to dinner with your Genovese friends, and what shall we eat? Oh, how about pesto? Yes! And we all run to the restaurant, and they all order the same food that they've eaten at home at lunch, and they've eaten the last 6 days, and the last 6 months, and every time they stick their fork in, like, this is the best thing that I've ever eaten on planet Earth. And they're right. But, you know, living in a more polyglot atmosphere, it's kind of hard to make friends with that as a permanent attitude toward gastronomy. But the history of the whole country is in its food, of course. Everyone knows that. Per favore, anche in italiano se vuoi. Certo.
Why not?
Sì.
Michele o Michael?
I'm so sorry, I don't know how to translate that difficult question, but it's an excellent one. Stella asks, when we work together, and we speak Italian, but are you Michele or Michael? Got to think about that. Infatti, this is, she's making me think. Both. You make me work so hard that I have to be Michael. And now and then you don't make me work so hard, and then I can be Michele. Maybe that's it. Although Michele is very hardworking. I don't have a good answer. I will have to get back to you later on that one, Miss Stella Levy. Ooh. Yes. Let me ask Lucia Francis Frank to answer that question. Lucia, could you give the microphone to the young lady with the stripes?
No.
It depends where we are, honestly. I mean, America, it can be either. I'm going to go with both, because, you know.
Are you more Lucia or Lucia? Yes, ma'am.
I have two very different questions. The first one is, I would like to know the reaction of your family, your book, The Mighty Franks. And because I read in an interview, you said you wrote thinking that they were not alive anymore. But
yes, ma'am.
I think they are, so I'm curious.
Yes, ma'am.
The second question is, for the magazine I'm writing for, I interview many American expats to Italy. Mm-hmm. And I had the impression that all of them were living as doppelganger in Italy.
Really?
They were describing, well, they were admitting to be other people while they were living there. They say, oh, you know, I was a personality A in America, and now I'm more so relaxed and friendly. And and they were describing, but they were also describing a country, Italy, that it was hard for me to recognize. Right. It was too idealized. Yes. And so what's your take on that and your experience with American expats in Italy?
I'll answer backwards. How's that? It's one of the reasons I made the reference in the earlier part of the evening to Under the Tuscan Sun. And there is that romanticizing of Italy that I think is understandable, question mark, but kind of lazy, because it suggests to me that you're not really paying attention to the world around you. I'm a little disappointed to hear that there are other doppelgangers out there, but I will accept it. And until I meet them and have a chat with them, I don't know how interesting they are. But you know, I think that it's very obviously a very typical thing for anyone who spends time in two places. You get to reinvent yourself. You have your return plane ticket. Think of all the things you don't have to think about: taxes, voting, garbage. You know, is it less of an authentic experience because you're not seeing the country in all its facets? Probably, but does it matter in the end? You know, humanly, I don't know. My family is still speaking to me, is the short answer to that question. Thank you for your questions.
Someone else?
Don't anyone move. I've got to take your picture to prove that you all came out to hear about Michele the Doppelganger. So don't go away for my art. And I won't post it on social media because I barely know how to use it. Don't contradict me. Yeah. Oh, one more question? Oh, you're just waving, Ms. Templecar. I want to thank you all for coming, and for my old friends who are here, my new friends who are here. Grazie a tutti. Thank you very much.
Thank you too, Michael.